With that, we're going to bring in members of our diplomatic community. Jeremy Kinsman is former Canadian ambassador to both Russia and the EU. Larry Haas is a former White House official and currently a senior fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council. Larry, I will begin with you. Another launch, a response by the United States. Donald Trump saying, "We will handle this." How do you think it's handled?
Well, the current approach is to apply increasing pressure in the form of sanctions, to rally our regional allies, to ensure that they have more firepower, whether it's the Japanese or the South Koreans or others, and at the same time to try to pressure the Chinese to rein in the North Koreans. Having said that, as we can see, it's not working very well. And that's because sanctions that are targeted at North Korea is something that the government does not seem to care much about, because the only ones that are suffering are the North Korean people, and the Chinese have prevented the global community from imposing the kinds of sanctions that could actually threaten the survivability of the regime. So we're in a tough spot now, and the North Koreans are making more progress. And the problem is that tensions are growing. The South Koreans are testing in response to the North Koreans, and I just fear a miscalculation. So we're in a tough spot.
Jeremy, is it time for Donald Trump to forget about Twitter, forget about Rocket Man, and just pick up the phone and say, hey, let's negotiate, let's talk?
Well, something like that, Scott. I don't know how you call Rocket Man, but something like that. And I think Tillerson said that today, that the road to solution still lies in diplomacy. Absolutely.
Now, who would have to convene something like that? Would the Chinese have to play a role in that?
Well, there's got to be somebody withstanding. And obviously the Chinese are there. They're a neighbor. And to some extent, they're the guarantor of North Korean security. North Koreans are reluctant to accept that. The Chinese have a very strong view that increased sanctions would only create chaos in North Korea, and that would create a refugee and disruption scenario that they want to avoid, and possibly the implosion of the regime. And we could say that would be good news for the world, maybe, but it would be chaotic on the Korean Peninsula. So yeah, the Chinese are the ones with the most leverage. They're the ones who are there, and they're the ones that the Americans have to connect to. And Justin Trudeau going to China, I obviously assume he's going to bring this up.
Larry, we are a far cry away from fire and fury. It's the last thing the world needs. Do you think that Donald Trump will actually start some sort of diplomatic procedure?
Predicting Donald Trump is something that I'm sure people have lost a lot of money on in the past, so I'm reluctant to predict. But having said that, I think that at a certain point, he comes to the realization that unless he's really going to launch fire and fury, which I doubt, if only because his advisors, his quite rational advisors, hopefully would talk him out of it, then, as Jeremy says, you really don't see much of an alternative. Sanctions are not deterring the North Koreans from making more progress. The more progress they make, the more progress, their adversaries in the region feel compelled to make in response to that. And we really need to reduce the tension. So at a certain point, yes, I think the president, as previous presidents have come to the same conclusion, will decide that negotiations are the only way, the only hope to reduce tensions. I worry, though, that the North Koreans, as they've done in the past, will not take negotiations seriously. That is, they'll cut a deal, and 2 or 3 years down the road, we'll find out that they violated the deal, made more progress, and we're in a worse position than when we started. And that's really the risk of negotiations, and it's another thing that nobody really has an answer to.
Jeremy, just about an hour ago, we got a statement from Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister, and the very last line says that Canada is going to convene a meeting specifically on this issue with foreign ministers to try to address this. What do you make of that, and what role can Canada play in all of this?
I got to be frank, Scott. I find that overreaching. Canada doesn't really have any standing on this particular issue. Canada can call a meeting, convene a meeting on a number of things, climate change, but on North Korea, I don't see it. So I'm not quite sure what's behind that statement. Canada would be one of the last countries, I would think, that would be in a position to convene such a meeting.
Larry, what do you make of that? A meeting co-hosted by Canada and the United States, taking place somewhere in Canada, the date so far unknown.
Well, clearly, if there's a meeting co-hosted by the United States and Canada, the United States on an issue like this is going to be the driving force. I'm impressed by Prime Minister Trudeau's aggressiveness, whether it's on this or on a variety of other things as he travels the world and makes various pronouncements. But at the end of the day, I have to agree with Jeremy. I mean, Trudeau's got to pick his spots, and this does seem to me like an overreach. When you think about the countries that have to be involved in a regional solution to the tensions on the Korean Peninsula, Canada is not high on the list, and frankly, I've never seen it on a list. So I'm with Jeremy on this. I think they're overreaching a bit.
Jeremy, speaking of picking his spots, the Prime Minister is about to head to China. We know that there's going to be a heavy focus on trade. What do you make of the timing of this? And is this an attempt to say, well, if NAFTA is in trouble, then we should have a safety net called trade with other countries?
We should have that anyway, Scott. That's clear. And a trip to China is absolutely essential. China is now, I think, our #2 trading partner at about $70 billion a year. Mm-hmm. And so it's fundamental. The Trudeau name, we go back 50 years to Pierre Trudeau breaking the ice and becoming the first Western country to recognize communist China after the Korean War. But it still resonates a bit. I wouldn't push it too far. I think he's got some, his name is an asset. We're not, in Chinese eyes, we are not a terribly important country. But I think we're a country that's well seen by Chinese. I mean, they lead now in the number of foreign students in Canada. I think they're #3 in the tourists who come to Canada. Chinese are looking to Canada, and Canada's aware of that. And there's a bit of unease about it. So it's an important visit.
Larry, if there's potential that Donald Trump is going to upend the NAFTA apple cart, is this a good move for the government of Canada to be making in terms of broadening trade?
I do think so. I think this is actually very shrewd. I mean, think about it from Canada's standpoint. They're participating in negotiations to try to come to an agreement over the TPP, which is the major regional trade deal. They're part of that. The Chinese are not part of that. So at the same time that Canada is trying to take advantage of its involvement with the TPP, it's trying to separately develop a stronger bilateral trade relationship with China. I think it's very shrewd. I'll say one more thing about it. Mm-hmm. It says to me that it is one more example of kind of the ground shifting around the world, mm-hmm. With the United States under Donald Trump kind of disparaging regional trade and questioning regional trade pacts like NAFTA, that more countries, whether because they're looking at the military side of China mm-hmm. or they're looking at the economic side of China, will look more seriously at China as the United States gives the appearance of retreating a bit on the world stage.
We'll see if human rights also come up during that visit. Larry Haas, Jeremy Kinsman, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.